is a computer-animated version of Whitney Root. Whitney was born in 1829 to Henry Root and Mary Whitney. He is the grandson of Nathaniel Root and Lois Barnes, who were originally from Connecticut. From a farm in New York, Whitney, along with his parents and 4 of his siblings, went to Wisconsin. And now for the rest of the story. This is the original photo that the computer animation was taken from. If you look really closely at the bottom, it says Miss E.G. Frizzell, Fort Atkinson. This picture was taken after 1864 by Emily Frizzell, whose husband died in the Civil War in 1863, leaving 31-year-old Emily to deal with 5 children. She decided to go into photography and became one of the leading photographers in Jefferson County and a prominent businesswoman in Fort Atkinson. So, sometime after 1850, the Henry Root family, minus daughter Eliza, left the family farm in New York and ventured 800 miles west to Fort Atkinson in Jefferson County. Whitney's dad, Henry, died in 1853 when Whitney was 24 years old. A few years later, in January of 1858, Whitney married Mary Jane Hubbard, daughter of Hugh Henderson Hubbard and Abigail Jones. In the 1860 census, Whitney was living on a farm with his wife, his mother Mary Whitney Root, and 2 siblings, Andrew Jackson and Julia Root. They were next door to Abram Vosburg's farm, where Whitney's sister Mary lived with her husband James Vosburg. By 1870, Whitney was living with his family on his own farm in the town of Sumner on the west side of Koshkonong Lake. Whitney moved several times but stayed in Jefferson County. He settled in the town of Fort Atkinson. Whitney registered for the Civil War in 1863 but was not drafted. If we look at the census data and town directories, we see that Whitney farmed for much of his life. But somewhere around 1882, he began to do carpentry work and did this into his 70s, and at age 79, he was retired. He died in 1909 and was buried in Lakeview Cemetery in Fort Atkinson. Late last night, the lumber office of Wilcox and Richard Company, the carpentry shops of Whitney Root, and 2 blacksmith shops owned by Charles Jackson and J. Bachman were entered presumably by tramps. Little damage was done. There are a great many tramps in this vicinity. Whitney married Mary Jane Hubbard, who was sometimes called Margaret Jane Hubbard. She was born in 1839 and died in 1902, 7 years before Whitney died, and she died at the age of 62. Mary Jane's parents were Hugh Henderson Hubbard and Abigail Jones. Mary Jane had 7 siblings. The Hubbard line is another prominent and prolific line in America. George Hubbard, Mary's 4 times great-grandfather, is listed on the same monument that Thomas Root is as a founder of Hartford, Connecticut. Mary Jane Hubbard's grandfather was Abner Hubbard. He served in the Revolutionary War, and after the war he settled in Jefferson County in Upper New York. He ran a tavern on what is now called Millen's Bay. When the War of 1812 broke out, at the age of 53, and without any orders from the military, took it upon himself to attack a fort on Carleton Island. There are several versions of the story. One is that he rode out with a neighbor and a young man, possibly his 25-year-old son, Stephen. One version is that it was several neighbors and a small boy. Abner and his crew were able to capture the fort without a gunshot. Although the fort was strategic in the American Revolution, the fort had fallen in disrepair. There are several versions of the capture. One is that they found 2 old sickly soldiers and 2 women. Some versions have the women as being ladies of the evening. Other versions have Abner and his comrades capturing several soldiers who were simply napping. Abner burned down the fort. There are only remnants there today. And he took the prisoners to Sackett Bay. The British never returned to the island, and the boundary of Canada now skirts to the north of Carleton Island. The fact that there must have been several discussions about the incident, many of them taking place in a tavern, may be the reason for the different versions to the story. However, it can be said, the first military action and the first prisoners of war of the War of 1812 was not a military action at all, but was the result of Abner Hubbard. Abner Hubbard's wife was Catherine Webster, another well-documented line that goes back to a one-term governor of the Connecticut colony, Governor John Webster. The line also has a famous lexicologist, a compiler of words, and that is Noah Webster. Daniel Webster was Secretary of State under 3 presidents, but Daniel and Noah on this list are neither of those 2 people. However, Noah Webster, the dictionary author, is related to the root line. Whitney and Mary Jane Root had 4 surviving children. Setting aside their firstborn, Edison, for now, I will start with Fanny. Fanny Adele Root was born in Jefferson County in 1864. At the age of 20, she married Edgar J. Gibson in 1884. Edgar, a year before, had opened up an office for the practice of medicine. He was the health officer for the next 26 years for Fort Atkinson and surrounding areas. They had 2 children, a daughter named Eva and a son named Leo. Fanny was age 60 when Edgar died in 1925, and she was 82 when her son Leo died in 1946. After her husband died, she lived with her daughter in Michigan for a while, but returned to Fort Atkinson where she died at the age of 93. Jessie May Root, born in 1874, was the 3rd child of Whitney and Mary Jane Root. She married George Klein, a jack of all trades. He dealt in real estate, importing and raising horses, and if that wasn't enough, he sometimes served as the Justice of the Peace. They married in 1896 and had 2 children, Margaret Viola Klein and Theodore Klein. George Klein died in 1947, and Jessie Root Klein died 10 years later in 1957. She was 82 years old. Claude Hubbard Root, the 4th and last child of Whitney and Mary Ann, was born in 1879. Career-wise, he was a machinist, steamfitter, and plumber. Claude married Clara Zahn in 1901, and they had a child, Gerald Whitney Root. Claude probably did not have very many early memories of his older brother Edison, who was working for the railroad and living in Minneapolis when Claude was only 5. Not sure what prompted the move, but in 1911, 2 years after his father Whitney's death, Claude and Clara moved west to South Dakota to Willow Lake in Clark County. One possible clue when looking at the founders of Clark County, among them is a woman named Damoth. Where did I hear that name before? On June 13th, Claude went for a swim in Lake Byron and dove off what he thought was deep water. It was shallow, and he broke his neck and was paralyzed. After treatment at the local hospital, he was brought all the way into Minneapolis for treatment. Claude Hubbard Root died on June 18th, leaving a wife and a 17-year-old son, Gerald Whitney Root. Gerald married a woman named Frederica Seefeld, and together they had 6 children between 1924 and 1940. Those 6 in turn had 10 descendants. Gerald farmed up until 1934, when he started for the Black Hills Packing Company, where he worked for 25 years. Gerald Whitney Root died in 1966. Frederica in 1980. Edison Wording Root was born in Jefferson County, Wisconsin in 1862 to Whitney Root and Mary Jane Hubbard Root. Of 4 siblings, he was the oldest, with a 17-year gap between him and the youngest child, Claude Hubbard Root. When Claude was born, Edison was preparing to move out, and within a year, he was out of the house. By 1884, Edison was staying at a hotel on a very short avenue called Clifton in the neighborhood around Loring Park, although at the time it was called Central Park. How did Edison wind up 300 miles west of Jefferson County, Wisconsin? Let's go back to Fort Atkinson, where the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad had started up in 1859 after almost 10 years of false starts, bankruptcies, and politics. Up to 16 trains traveled from Fort Atkinson to the east, the west, and to the north. If we look back to the 1884 directory, we see Edison was listed as a night operator, which meant telegraph operator for the railroads for the night shift. Interestingly, there are 2 Roots who are working for the railroad as telegraph operators. One is even staying at the Clifton House as an operator, and that is N. Root. The other is John A. Root, who is living in southeast Minneapolis. Are one or both of these related to Edison? Did they help him get a job with the railroad? Possibly, probably, but regardless of how he started with the railroad, he moved up fast. In 1886, he was elected to be the chief telegrapher. No more night shifts. The year prior was an even bigger year for Edison. In 1885, he moved out of the boarding house and into a new place at 611 North 3rd Street. This house does not exist now. But more importantly, Edison in April married an Irish woman named Margaret, aka Maggie Powell. And in December, Maggie and Edison had their first child, George Elmer Root. Apparently, he was not busy enough that year. In November of 1885, he was given athletic exhibitions out of the Minneapolis Club. Does anybody know what bat-tooth leaping is? The only thing I could find is something that targets the glutes and thighs. Also, gladiatorial pyramids. Good luck looking that one up. Edison and Maggie Powell Root had 5 children, all boys. Firstborn was George, who was born in 1885. He married Hazel Ferris in 1909, and they had 2 children. Next came Earl Whitney Root, who was born in 1887. He married a French woman named Stella Marie Hébert in 1911, and they had 2 children. Next came Fred Root, who was born in 1889. Freddie died from a horrible accident when a kerosene lamp fell over and burnt him. He died at the age of 8. After Freddie came Leslie Hubbard Root, born in 1895. Leslie married Mary Lee de Letray in 1920, and they had no children. Last born was Lyle Root in 1907. At the age of 7, Lyle died from being hit by a car when he went into the street to fetch a ball that he was playing with. 13 years later, in 1927, Maggie Powell Root would also die from getting hit by a car, this time in downtown Minneapolis. Her husband Edison died 2 years later at the age of 66 from a heart attack while he was on a stroll. Maggie, Edison, Freddie, and Lyle are all buried at Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis. And now you know the rest of the story. Or do you? Every family is as unique as fingerprints, and every family is connected to previous families like the strands of DNA that we are made of. This story is not finished. There's still more to discover about the past as well as the yet unwritten accounts of the future.